Hello. The screencast is if you were absent from class on the opening lecture for Understanding the Author in the Novel Lord of the Flies for English 1 Honors. Today we're going to be talking about the novel Lord of the Flies. And in order to understand Lord of the Flies, you have to understand a little bit about the author. This is William Golding. If you take a look at his birth and death dates, he was born in 1911 in Cornwall, England, and died in 1993. One of the things we talked then about in class is what you know about world history. And one of the things that most people notice when they look at William Golding is that his lifetime spanned 2 world wars and a lot of other conflicts. So that's one thing that we talk about in class, and it has actually a lot to do with his life and how he wrote and the things that he wrote about. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as the slideshow progresses. But he attended a place called Marlborough Grammar School in England, and his father was a teacher there. His father wanted him to study science just like he did, so he went off to Brasenose College in Oxford to study natural sciences in order to please his father. But while he was there, he changed it to English literature. As you can imagine, if you know parents, his father was not very pleased that he decided to change his major from natural sciences to English literature. But that's all right. He went on with his life. And in his early years, he graduated in 1934, which, if you know anything about world history, 1936 is the year that essentially Hitler invaded the first country that he invaded. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it was Austria. Anyway, and that was 2 years after he graduated with a degree in English literature and published a collection of poems entitled Creatively Poems. And in the early years, as World War II was slowly approaching, he became a teacher at a place called Michael Hall School. Michael Hall School was an okay school, but he wanted to kind of move up in the ladder. So he started teaching at Bishop Wordsworth School in Salisbury, and he passed his exams in order to be a teacher for this more prestigious school. But he left that in September, and he took a post at Maidstone Grammar School, which was a boarding school, which is where the students who go to school there not only go to school but also live in the school, much like Harry Potter, if you want to think about it that way. He met a woman there named Anne Brookfield, and they fell in love. And a few weeks after war was declared in 1939, he married Brookfield in a registrar's office and became one of many, many, many couples in that time period that married as soon as war was declared for a lot of different reasons. He went to war. In 1940, he had one son, about a year after marriage, whose name was David, and he signed up for the Navy. He volunteered to serve. And he served in the war from 1941 to 45 throughout almost the entire course of England's participation in the war. And he saw some of the bloodiest battles. The Navy does a lot of work transporting men to and from the battle lines, and they're usually one of the first lines of defense. So what we saw as a result of his participation in the war is that the theme of war and how it affects human beings is evident in all of his writings, poetry, long novels, and short stories, and all of that. So when he was done with the war, he turned back to writing and teaching. He worked at Bishop Wordsworth School in England, and then moved with his family to Salisbury. Now he had a daughter and a son, David and Judith Diana. So he began working in 1952 on a novel entitled The Strangers Within, and he sent it out after a year. It took about a year to write, which is pretty good for a first novel. Usually takes people much longer, but it was rejected by many, many publishers. But finally, a year later, in 1953, Faber and Faber accepted it for publication, and they suggested certain changes. He accepted those changes, and in 1954, it was published under the title Lord of the Flies, which is the book that we are reading. Now, it's important for you to remember that The Strangers Within was the first title for the book, and we're going to talk about that as we're reading the book, whether you think Lord of the Flies or The Strangers Within is a better title. So Golding's entire work as a writer, He published 12 books. He had a number of plays. He worked as a literary correspondent and a radio broadcaster. Um, a literary correspondent is basically someone who looks at literature and studies literature and talks about literature. So it was actually really well suited to the job or the major that he switched himself to. In 1962, they moved to the United States, and he taught at a liberal arts college in Virginia called Hollins. And after teaching there for 23 years and continuing to write, in 1985, he moved back to England and settled in Cornwall, back where he was born. All right, so what you need to understand about the novel and its roots. The novel is actually a story on one level, but it also has its roots in 20th century psychology. And that psychology has to deal with this man, who is Sigmund Freud, considered the father of modern psychology. And he created something called the psychoanalytic model in the early 20th century. He was a German. What Sigmund Freud, psychoanalytic theory, had a lot of different components to it. But one of the components was that he believed that there were three parts of the human mind, the subconscious, that interact and wrestle with each other for decision making. So the result is a constant struggle that defines human behavior. So one part will think that the human should do one thing and argue with the other. And that's why we have difficulty making decisions, because so many different parts of our subconscious are warring with each other, according to Freud. So he named these three parts. The first part is called the id. That's pronounced id, and it's always lowercase id, but it stands for inner desire, the id. Now, the inner desire is something that is considered, like just like it sounds, the inside desires of all human beings. So it's based on base instincts like the desire for food, sex, aggressive impulses like fighting. So there's one portion of the brain that controls this concept that I want something and I want it now, and it's basically all about survival instincts. It's that kind of bestial side of all humans, where you're not necessarily governed by human behavior, you're actually governed by something that's more of an instinct. Its drives are divided into life and death drives. So everything that it wants is either to continue living or to avoid death. Food, sex, aggression, that sort of thing. The second part of the human subconscious is referred to by Freud as the ego. The ego is basically referred to as the I, which it means that it's kind of like a blank slate, and it's a mediator. So the id opposes the superego, which we'll talk about next, and the ego in the middle sort of tries to find a balance between the two. When it says it contains the consciousness of the mind, it means that in the ego is where we see our identity. So whatever makes up Mrs. Dunn is composed of the ego, and the id is something a little bit different. The ego is concerned with safety, and it stands for reason and caution, because it's always, let's think a little bit before we make a decision. It is still fun, so it doesn't suppress all the id desires, but only if the consequences of the action are minor. So, and as long as they're not that, the drives aren't that strong, I guess. All right, so the ego is often personified as a slave to three harsh masters. A slave to the id, a slave to the superego, and a slave to itself, essentially. And we'll talk about this as the book goes on, too. Okay, the third part of the human mind is considered the superego. And the superego is all law and business. It's the father figure of the mind. So it's the one that's fighting against the inner desires. It acts as the conscience. So that means that it is laying down the law and telling you what the difference is between right and wrong. So if you think about if you've ever seen a cartoon and a character is trying to decide between one thing or another, and an angel pops up on one shoulder and the devil pops up on the other, the devil is the id, the angel is the superego, and the ego is the person in the middle, fighting between and trying to decide which way to go. Sometimes the id wins, sometimes the superego wins, sometimes the ego comes to a decision that combines both what the id wants and the superego wants and kind of mediates between the two. There is a fourth part that Freud barely talked about but brushed upon, and that is called intuition. We've talked about intuition when we talked about our personality types for the career paper, but intuition is the sixth sense part of the brain. It's when we talked about people who are intuitive, they know something without having to know it. So it's that gut feeling that you get when you think something is right versus wrong. You can't really explain it to anyone else, but you know how you feel and you know which way you head. It's not guided by reason, but it's an apparent outside ability, meaning some people have really strong intuitions and are able to explain them a little bit. But most people who are intuitive, like strongly intuitive, can't really explain their feelings. They just know that they're right. It is frequently silenced by the superego because it doesn't have any reasons, and it's also silenced by the id because it blocks access to social taboos. So, intuition tells you, gives you a gut feeling, maybe without reason, that behaving in a certain way is wrong, and the id never likes that because it wants to behave in whatever way it wants to. So, the subconscious and the Lord of the Flies. So, what Golding did with Freud's theories is he latched onto them as one of the main portions of the book. The book is written as an allegory, and an allegory is a story where each character symbolizes something else. So, characters, the main characters in the story, each symbolize a part of the human subconscious and what we would expect if a human being was left to develop outside of cultural morality. So, when we talk about people being deserted on a deserted island, in the case of Lord of the Flies, they are left without culture any longer to tell them what the difference is right and wrong. They're essentially basic humans, and now we have to decide how they're going to be driven and how their decisions are going to be made. And that's basically the concept behind the book. So when we look at the story of Lord of the Flies, we're looking at a group of 6 to 12-year-old boys who are stranded on an island after their plane is being shot down, and they have to figure out how to create a civilization. And some of our main characters will represent these 4 different parts of the human brain. We're going to talk about this throughout the entirety of Lord of the Flies and discuss how we can see the id, the ego, and the superego in each of these characters. So it'd be a really good idea to get a good handle on what is the id, what's the ego, and the superego before you start reading, so you can read with a little bit of a purpose in trying to identify which character is who. All right. I hope that helps you get a little bit better understanding about the book. And if you are absent from class, we hope we see you soon.